Welcome everybody. Today's chapter, chapter 17, is called Hosea and His Unfaithful Wife. Amos had been the first of the great prophets of Israel to spell out the basic truth which the Old Testament as a whole stands for, that religion and morality, faith and conduct, belief and practice are two sides of the same coin. He had been a harsh critic of his times. He'd seen the failure of Israel to live up to the high standards which were required of the people of God. And he had, with perfect logic, drawn the obvious conclusion. Israel was doomed. God had no further use for her. In terms of practical politics, this meant her extinction as a nation. The next in the sequence of spokesmen of God who moulded Israel's understanding of her vocation was Hosea. He flourished about 20 years later than Amos, only 10 years or so before Israel's downfall. What had been clear to Amos, namely that Israel's days were numbered, had now become apparent to politicians and people as well, as the Assyrians swept one little state after another off the map. Hosea was no less trenchant than Amos in his denunciation of the society of his day, of the failure of kings, priests and people. Yet Hosea had a deeper understanding of God and of human failings than Amos had. Hosea also saw disaster ahead, and like Amos, looked on it as the just punishment that Israel deserved. But unlike Amos, he did not believe that God would finally write off what had been for him a costly experiment. He had chosen Israel, and from her infancy had been trying to teach her, despite her failures, what it meant to be the people of God. Could he now, as Amos seemed to think, turn his back upon the child of his choice because she had become wayward and willful? Was there no future for the bride to whom Yahweh had plighted his troth in the long-distant days of Moses and the covenant? It is in poetic imagery of this kind that Hosea conceived the relationship between God and his people. But undoubtedly the conclusion he reached, that Yahweh had still a purpose for his people, and that after a time of discipline there would still be in Israel a people of God, to stand for truth in the world at large, was founded upon his own experience and upon what he'd learnt from it. Hosea's contribution to our understanding of God springs from the tragedy of his own unhappy marriage. The contents of the book that bears his name are very disjointed. We're not told anything about Hosea's background, what sort of family he came from, or what he did for a living. But so far as we can make out, as a young man he had married Gomer, the girl of his choice, and to begin with their marriage had been a happy one. There was nothing to suggest the tragedy that lay ahead. Their first child, a boy, was born into a home where husband and wife found in each other the perfect kind of love and companionship that marriage was meant to provide. Then something went wrong. Gomer began to tire of her husband. We're not told why, so we can only guess. Hosea clearly loved his wife, but perhaps not in the way she wanted. Perhaps life with an earnest and serious-minded young prophet was a bit of a strain for a light-hearted, lively young girl. So Gomer had an affair with another man and had a child by him, this time a daughter. How much Hosea knew about the affair we do not know, but he certainly knew that the child was not his. In those days, adultery was a capital offence. According to the law, the penalty was death for both parties. But whatever Hosea thought about the law, or his wife's lover, the one thing he knew was that he still loved his wife. We can, if we like, fill in the picture. The shock of discovery, Hosea's anger, Gomer's tears. It can't have been any different in ancient Israel from today when a husband or a wife feels betrayed and humiliated. Whatever went on inside the home, the world knew nothing of it. Whatever stormy scenes there may have been, Hosea's love for Gomer won the day. He acknowledged the child as his own, and he set out to rebuild the broken home. For a time all went well. Gomer knew that she'd wronged her husband and that he had forgiven her simply because he loved her. This would have been enough for most women, but it was not enough for Gomer. Psychologists would no doubt suggest a reason, but the Bible, as usual, does not go into detailed explanations. It simply says that she had another affair with someone else and became pregnant once more. This was the last straw as far as Hosea was concerned, and he threw her out. Gomer drifted from bad to worse and became a common prostitute. Hosea nursed his grief in an empty home. But however much he plunged himself into his public work and busied himself with the great issues of his day, there was always an ache in his heart. He couldn't forget the girl with whom he'd found such happiness in the early years of his marriage. She'd let him down and treated him disgracefully, yet to his own astonishment he found he still loved her and he wanted her back. So he sought her out and at last found her, a piece of human wreckage, up for auction in a slave market. What he had to pay for her was not a vast amount, but it was a lot to him. He took her back to his home and began the weary, slow process of recovering the happiness that they had lost. But it took a long time. Old habits die hard. And for a while, Hosea kept his wife not only under his eye, but also under his thumb. Yet what brought Gomer back to being the woman she'd once been was not so much her husband's severity as his love and forgiveness. And the end of the story is once again a happy home and a husband and wife reconciled and facing life together in a true partnership of affection and trust. But of course the Bible would not be the Bible if that was all there was to it. Remember that Hosea was a prophet of Israel. Like the other great figures of the Old Testament, Hosea saw God's hand in everything and heard God speaking to him in the affairs of every day. He knew, of course, from his boyhood that the God he'd been taught to believe in was a God who hates sin, but has mercy on even persistent sinners. He knew that sin brings its own punishment, but that the greatest truth about God is his care and concern for men and women. But somehow, his own experience made this all come to life in a new way. He remembered that no matter how his wife had wronged him, he'd never ceased to love her. And if he, a mere man, could feel this ache in his heart for the wife who deserted him, how much more must this be true of God? And so Hosea, as we can see from his book, has a depth of understanding of God's love and compassion for the wayward and the wandering, which brings him very close to the mind of Jesus. He doesn't gloss over sin any more than Jesus did, or pretend that it does not matter. But his own suffering had taught him that the ultimate truth about life is the infinite patience and the infinite love of God.